This is Godzilla's year. First up, -1 becomes a massive box office sensation back in Japan and the United States. And then he goes and wins his first ever Oscar. And now he's in another movie with that big ape King Kong. So things are looking up for the big G, which is a feat when you're like 50 meters tall or 100 meters or 140 or whatever size he is now. But I still have questions. So let's see if we can find out these answers before nature points out the folly of man. Question number 1. How many different continuities are there? So this is an interesting question, and honestly, they're all going to be interesting because the Godzilla franchise is unlike many others. Let's face it, there's not a lot of film series that have been more than 30 entries and has been rebooted fairly consistently. The only thing I can think of to compare it to would be the Bond series, although there's some sort of series in other countries that have run like a lot of entries, but several of those weren't even meant to connect and are just films with the same character in the lead, like Tarzan. But over the course of his 38 films, as of 2023, Godzilla has had about 12 different continuities. Not all of them were hard reboots, though, and some are questionable that they're reboots at all. So, let's talk through it. Godzilla first appeared in 1954 in what's called the Showa films. They're referred to as such as they were all released during the reign of the Japanese Emperor Showa, who was around from 1926 to 1989. This version of the character ran for 15 films, with the final one being The Terror of Mechagodzilla in 1975. One thing to note, and something we'll touch on later, is that these films are all the same Godzilla, since the monster is killed in the original film, and the one that shows up in Godzilla Raids Again is actually a different creature. That continuity doesn't really have a definitive finale, as that movie wasn't actually intended to be the last one, and the series was ended due to poor ticket sales. The second official continuity begins with 1984's The Return of Godzilla, which most Americans know as Godzilla 1985, and once again, it's presented as a second Godzilla, and not the same one as in Godzilla 54. This version lasted through 7 movies from 1984 to 1995, and is referred to as the Heisei area, named after the then Emperor Heisei. Unlike the first continuity, this one did have a set ending, as they chose to film Godzilla vs. Destoroyah to mark it as the death of Godzilla. And sure enough, they do kill off the Big G in the finale, as he melts down due to a radiation overload. At this point, the Americans took a shot at the title and introduced their own version of the lizard, and even though it doesn't really seem all that much like Godzilla, it's definitely a reboot and is not in continuity with the other films, even though Zilla, as he would soon be referred to, showed up in a Japanese film. But that's a very clearly separate universe. But then, Japan brought him back for a series of 6 films called the Millennium Era that were unique in that they were each featuring a different continuity. Well, almost. And were a fresh start with each film. Godzilla 2000 just has Godzilla around. It never explains how he survived the oxygen destroyer, and it's possible this version exists in a vacuum, and in this one, the first film didn't happen. The next one, Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, reboots again, and is a world where the oxygen destroyer wasn't used. The next one, GMK, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, is very different and posits Godzilla as an embodiment of the souls of those killed in the Pacific War, and he's much more of a clear-cut villain in this one. The next 2 are the only Millennium entries to share a continuity, as there was Godzilla against Mechagodzilla and Godzilla Tokyo SOS that again ignores everything but the original, and the final one was appropriately titled Final Wars, which not only had Godzilla, but practically every single Toho kaiju possible. This one is unique in that it very clearly ignores the 54 Godzilla and is entirely its own universe. So, we had the Showa, Heisei, US, 2000, Megaguirus, GMK, Tokyo SOS, and now Final Wars continuities. So that puts us at 8 so far. Next up, there was another American take with the MonsterVerse versions, which is now 4 films, and in these, the 54 version doesn't exist, and they're another brand new timeline. But then, in 2016, Japan had Shin Godzilla, another one that starts fresh. It kicked off what is now called the Reiwa era, and was followed by a 3-part anime trilogy that was again its own thing. The 12th and final version so far is of course Godzilla -1, which again reboots everything and gives the big fella a whole new origin. So that's the main 12 versions that have shown up in films, but there's probably additional continuities if you take other media into account. For instance, there's the Hanna-Barbera animated version. He's definitely his own thing. And the Japanese anime series Singular Point, and even the silly 90s shorts called Godzilla Island. So, with that in mind, just know that every other question that shows up here is going to be seen through 12 different lenses. Question number 2. So what is Godzilla? So, as I just said, this is going to vary based upon which continuity we're discussing, since there's a few outliers, like the American 98 version, or the MonsterVerse take. But believe it or not, what exactly the dude is pretty consistent throughout. In general, he's a dinosaur that somehow managed to survive and remained on some remote Japanese island. He was either unnaturally long-living or just the latest in a long line of descendants. His body is reminiscent of several dinosaurs and has quite a bit of similarities to a Tyrannosaurus, although obviously those spines have more in common with the Stegosaurus. But a couple of films have gone a little further with fleshing out his whole deal. In 1991's Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, he's revealed to be a different type of dinosaur called the Godzillasaurus, and the last of a species that lived on Lagos Island. In that one, they actually went back in time to prevent Godzilla from ever happening, but then are forced to recreate the incident and allow him to be reborn. In the original script for the film, he was simply meant to be a Tyrannosaurus, and concept art was developed to show him that way, but it was then decided that this didn't feel right, and he should instead evolve from a dino that more closely resembled his later appearance. The Godzillasaurus was then developed and created as a way to explain that. In this form, he does not have the dorsal spines, and they were a result of the radioactive mutations. A different take on what his dinosaur form looks like can be seen in -1, as there's a very different sort of big lizard there that doesn't quite appear to be based on any actual existing species. Like, look at this thing. I really don't know what it's supposed to be, but it's just very likely several steps along the evolutionary scale. After all, this is something that has been through a few million years of further evolution along the way, so it's not likely to look the same as a standard T-Rex or whatever. I would just like to point out that the one big difference here seems to be the MonsterVerse Godzilla. As far as I can tell, this is the only version that did not start as some other sort of dinosaur, only to be transformed by nuclear radiation. In fact, this guy survived some nuclear blasts during World War II, where they were trying to destroy it. But this version has been in this particular form for ages, and it's stated that it has been dormant for hundreds of millions of years. But the rarest of all Godzillas is the one that I created. This version is one that was a dinosaur that was exposed to massive amounts of radiation and got cancer and died. It's a bummer, but I was shooting for realism. Question number 3. What does Godzilla eat? I'm not sure if you've noticed this or not, but Godzilla is big. How big is he? Well, Godzilla is so big that he went to the doctor's office and had to write down his weight on the survey form, and they said, "Sir, we asked for your weight, not your phone number." Godzilla is so big, he got baptized at SeaWorld. Godzilla is so big, he went to KFC and they asked him what size bucket, and he asked for the one on the roof. But that last gag raises an interesting question. Depending on which version it is, Godzilla ranges anywhere from 50 meters tall to 120 meters. For the metric impaired, that's around 160 feet to 400 feet. A creature that big sure would have to eat a lot, right? Originally, they had sort of wanted the big guy to be seen eating things. There's a lost bit from the original film, right after Greenie first appeared over the hill, that he was seen to be munching on a cow. This footage is gone, though, and not included in the film, so it's not exactly canon. Later on, Godzilla Jr. is seen munching on whales in Godzilla vs. Destroyer, so one could possibly interpret that to mean that the big fella does too. But keep in mind, the little guy is still in his non-mutated state. He's still what they would call a Godzillasaurus, and not a Godzilla, so he's obviously not the same thing. But the fact is that over the course of the series, we never once see the G-Man eating anything for sustenance. And that's because he no longer needs what we would think of as food. Godzilla feeds entirely on radiation and energy. This is why he's constantly attacking power plants and the like. It's very likely that he only contains a finite amount of energy within him and needs to regularly fuel up, a type of hunger. I would theorize that these feedings are likely the entire purpose of Godzilla's topside rampages, and were it not for these hunger pangs, he'd be happy to stay under the water and stay away from cities and such. Not that he's not willing to use that mouth and chompers in his attacks, though. After all, one of the most famous images of the dude is him with an entire train in his teeth, so he'll use them if he has to. Now, this whole thing is pretty consistent throughout almost all of the variations and continuities. Even the MonsterVerse version has been said to thrive on radiation. Now, it's said that the 54 version ate all the livestock around, so it's possible that he did eat them, even if it wasn't shown on screen. But we don't see it, so we can't say for certain that he did eat them. It's also very likely that he doesn't need to eat, but sometimes still does. I mean, after all, we see the MonsterVerse version chomping down on a Ghidorah head, but it seems like he did that more for fun than anything else. But there's one version that we know has to eat stuff, and it's the 98 Zilla version. That sucker eats a whole lot of seafood, and you know what they say, you can tune a piano, but you can't tune a fish. Yeah, I'm sorry. Question number 4. What gender is Godzilla? This answer is not as simple as you would expect. I think that when you see the big guy, you think, it's a big guy. A he. Hell, I've been calling him a he and a him all throughout this video, so it would appear as if Godzilla is clearly of the male gender. But it turns out that it's not that clear, and that the big G may be more gender neutral than anything else. Apparently, in the original Japanese versions of the films, Godzilla and most other kaijus are referred to only with the pronoun it, referring to them as more things than actual people. But in the English translations, those words were transposed into the masculine, and he, him was used. To make it more clear that he's not meant to be strictly male, in the original Showa continuity, he has a kid that hatched from an egg. I'll get to that in a bit, but that fact adds to the issue. Now, the 98 American version has been confirmed to be an asexually reproducing male. But even that is questionable, since Patrick Tatopoulos, who created the design, has stated on the DVD commentary that they sculpted female genitalia into the CGI model of it. The status of the 98 version is actually the source of quite a few arguments online, and even Tatopoulos calls it a he during that same commentary, although he also referred to it as a she at times. It's said in the film that Godzilla reproduces asexually, and in nature, lizards that do so are generally female, although I'm not entirely sure that we consider Godzilla something that's explicitly in nature. But going back to the Japanese versions, there's even less clarity. When Haruo Nakajima, the actor who wore the suit most frequently, was asked the question, he actually stated that he had no idea. But he seems to recall Ishiro Honda, the director of the 54 Godzilla, saying that the creature was intended to be female. But regardless, in discussion, Godzilla has generally always been referred to as a guy, and was even called King of the Monster, although that could just be easy labeling. After all, the Tyrannosaurus Rex is frequently referred to as he and him, and yet we know conclusively that it and all the other dinosaurs in Jurassic Park are female. But then, Godzilla's co-creator, Tomoyuki Tanaka, weighed in on the matter and stated that Godzilla was most probably male. And my take on it is this: if Godzilla is male, it's pretty clear that he's not strictly male. It's not as simple as Godzilla is just a boy, the end. I think that the clearest option is the one that the Japanese took in the beginning. He is gender neutral. He's a creature that is beyond gender. It's an it or a them. But since his primary traits are getting drunk on radiation and smashing things up and destroying, we tend to assign male pronouns to it. But like, he's most destructive when he's hungry, so shouldn't that make Godzilla more feminine? Question number 5. Where do Godzilla's kids come from? Again, this is a question that varies depending upon the continuity, but there are several versions of the big guy with kids. The Showa era had the most notable one with Minya, or Manila, who I think is the one that people most think about, and that weird thing huffing out those smoke rings. The Heisei area had their own offspring with Godzilla Jr., who we first see as a weird baby thing in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 from 1993, and grows with each successive entry, and eventually replaces Godzilla after his death in Godzilla vs. Destroyer. Finally, there's the American version that has a whole bunch of smaller velociraptor-sized offspring that create a problem for a portion of that film. And oh yeah, I guess I should also include Godzuki, if that counts. Let's start with Manila. We first meet him in Son of Godzilla, and actually witness him hatching out of an egg. Godzilla takes on the role of its guardian, but it's never truly clear if there's any direct parentage involved. The egg is being toyed with by several giant mantises, known as Kamakuras, and it's possible that the egg was dormant, and this tampering woke it up and caused it to hatch. There's the implication that he's simply from the same species that Godzilla was from before he was mutated, and the egg has been dormant for a long time and was not directly related to Godzilla. But I'm not sure that that's entirely feasible, since it has radioactive breath. That element seems to denote that it was mutated as well. I suppose it's possible that the egg was dormant and altered by the same radiation that Godzilla was transformed by, but I don't know, look, what are the odds that it transformed him in the same way? Well, I suppose it's pretty likely, since we know that the Big G is not the only one of his species, since one was killed by the Oxygen Destroyer, and the one that's adopting him is the second one. But there's several different options here. One is that the egg had been there since prehistoric times, or was simply one of the eggs of the dinosaur species that Godzilla began as, and was mutated by the radiation. 2 is that he actually is Godzilla's child, and the G laid the egg, and he reproduces asexually, just like the 98 version. 3 is that the egg belonged to the 54 version of Godzilla, and that version was female, and the other one is male, and either they had this egg together, or the female asexually produced it. Now, when it comes to Godzilla Jr., in the Heisei era, there is a distinct difference. He does not appear to be as mutated as his older version, but he's still clearly radioactive. So it's not just some dormant Godzillasaurus egg from prehistoric times. It has been affected by the radioactivity as well. So the same 3 options apply. After all, the Heisei Godzilla is also confirmed to be a second Godzilla, separate from the 54 one. Oh, there's also the Manila from Final Wars, who just shows up out of nowhere, but that's a one-off, and there's very little lore explained there, so there's really not enough info. But then there's the 98 version, and that's the clearest cut of all of them. Those are the actual offspring of Godzilla, formed through asexual reproduction. And then there's just that little jerk Godzuki. This cartoon comic relief was never meant to be Godzilla's kid, and is explicitly referred to as his nephew. But he's way, way smaller than the big guy, so who knows if he's the same type of creature or just another similar species of lizard. I mean, he has wings, so it's clear that he's slightly different. And, Wings. Nephew. I'm thinking that this cartoon Godzilla also has another of his type out there, a brother of sort. And since the kid has wings, bird-like wings, that brother porked Rodan. Question number 6. Is Godzilla good or bad? Yeah, this is another thing that greatly varies based on continuity, but sometimes even within the continuity. Let's go through it, shall we? In the original 54 film, he's clearly not good. It's hard to say that he's bad or evil since he's just kind of indifferent. He's on his way to his food and we're just in the way. It's the equivalent of you walking through some anthills on your way to that taco food truck that's always near your neighborhood, and if there's not, I would consider moving if I were you. It's the second movie that plants the seeds that the big lizard ain't evil and is merely acting on instinct, and that's the way it would remain until Ghidorah the three-headed monster. In this one, Godzilla is shown to have intelligence and can communicate, and Mothra is able to convince both him and Rodan to team up to fight Ghidorah. This movie marks his sort of turn, even though in the next one he's destroying again, but it's clearly because he's under alien control. Once freed from that control, he acts as a guardian and defeats the alien, and in the films after this, he actively fights against the creatures that are coming to destroy the Earth, becoming more of a clear-cut hero. So, hold that thought because we'll come back to him, but when the G-Man came back in the Return of Godzilla, it was a rebooted continuity, and he was restored to that more base personality and is once again a sheer force of destruction with very little intelligence and in search of energy sources. The only film in the Heisei series that would have Godzilla acting in the role of more of a defender of Earth is Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, although that one is simply portrayed as him fighting against a threat to himself and rival for the alpha role, as opposed to him wanting to protect humans. Once the Millennium Saga began, it got a little more inconsistent, with him acting as more of an uncontrollable threat, with his GMK version seeming more straight up downright evil. It was only in Final Wars that he seemed to show some sign of intelligence and respect for humans, sparing the people at the end thanks to his kid's intervention. Of the newer films, Shin kept that same representation of a mindless beast, and the same more or less went for -1. The MonsterVerse version is kind of funny because he's presented as a good guy and heroic defender of Earth, but sure as hell seems to kill a lot of people in the process. Who knows how many people died in Hawaii simply because the dude decided to show up. But yeah, for the most part, his portrayal is fairly consistent with being a lumbering Hulk that just destroys because stuff is in his way, not out of malice. The biggest issue here is the Showa version who changes over the course of his continuity. So, why is that? I mean, from a behind-the-scenes level, it was because Toho realized the character was embraced by children, so they wanted to appeal more to them by making the character a good guy and lovable icon. But how about in film? Can we see a rationale for it? Well, what if that version never stopped mutating? What if the effects of the radiation over time were continuing to evolve him and eventually went to work on his mind, granting him greater intelligence and emotion? What if, over the course of time, he continued to change and grow into a more mature and developed animal that had thoughts and desires and wants? And that desire was to play basketball. Question number 7. Why does Godzilla hate Tokyo so much? Some things just go together. Peanut butter and jelly. Cinnamon Toast Crunch in my stomach. Andy Dick and death pools. And of course, Godzilla and Tokyo. This guy's had 38 movies or so and attacks Japan almost exclusively and gives special attention towards destroying Tokyo. And oddly enough, even though this is one of the more common questions that I see when it comes to Godzilla, I think that it's a pretty simple answer. Now, there are some instances where this is not the case. For instance, MonsterVerse Godzilla goes all over and tends to be not near Japan. His MO is to just show up wherever his opponents are. The 98 Godzilla also didn't show up there because, again, it's an American film, so there's more emphasis on him showing up in America. There's times that it's been said that his attacks are done in a form of retaliation, particularly the GMK version. But it seems to me like it's way simpler than that. We know that Godzilla was a dinosaur that lived on an island near the coast of Japan. It's said that it was most likely the nuke tests at the Bikini Atoll that did it, which places him on an island in the North Pacific Ocean, somewhere between the coast of Asia, where Japan is, and Hawaii. So, there's a couple of land masses near this general area. There's Japan if it heads north, and Papua New Guinea if it went south. It could also go due west and go into the Philippines, but I think that after it mutated, it went into the sea and then headed north, eventually hitting Japan, where it found that radiation source that it liked to feed on. From that point on, considering that the big guy acts more out of instinct and animal-like behavior, it became its stomping ground. He marked his territory. This is something that is even stated in -1. From that point on, it's just a matter of coming back to the spot that it sees as its turf. It's a shame that we didn't see that literally, because we could have seen him pee on it and seen how he did it and solved that whole dispute of Godzilla being male or female or whatever. Question number 8. What is that big skeleton in Godzilla 2014? So the MonsterVerse kicked off with a new version of Godzilla, simply titled Godzilla. And we've just taken to calling it Godzilla 2014, and it's a full-on reboot with a new take on the fella. Well, the very first scene sets the stage for things by showing us a group of scientists from a company called Monarch, and are investigating a cavern in the Philippines. There, they find this massive skeleton, and they're standing right in its ribcage, and I admire their willpower to just not play it like a xylophone like they were in the Flintstones or something or whatever. But then we see that something had burrowed out from this cavern and headed into the ocean. So, what's up with this? And what was that skeleton? So they find 2 spores there, and over the course of the film we find out that those are both the Mutos, which are the enemy kaiju from this entry. Apparently either they or whatever spawned them has been feeding off the remains of this creature in the caves for quite a while, and eventually hatch out and take off. But what about the big skeleton? It's not explained within the movie, so what was it? It appears to be somewhat snake-like, so is this meant to be a version of Manda or something? Well, as it turns out, there is an official answer to this, although it's not something that's in the film itself and can only be found in external materials. There was a comic book called Godzilla Aftershock that was published by Legendary Comics. It was considered an official tie-in for the movies and is more or less canon. Aftershock details events after Godzilla 2014 and before King of the Monsters, and has him taking on a new enemy called Muto Prime, and is said to be the parent of the 2 Mutos from the film. His book actually explains the origin of that skeleton and says it belongs to a titan called Dagon, also known as Raijin. It's said that back in the 11th century BC, there was an encounter with Dagon, or a creature that they thought was the old god Dagon, so they named it that. They see it battle the Muto Prime and watch it get defeated, and then the Primo then injects its corpse with its parasitic little babies. Dagon then took off and went back to the sea, and it eventually died in the Philippines, where its skeleton would lay in rest until 1999, when Monarch discovered it in the movie. There's an image of Dagon in the book, and he appears to be very similar to Godzilla in design, and is very likely a member of the same species. The book's author described it as being more kind towards humans than Godzilla, and when asked if it would have radioactive breath, he stated, "I don't see why not." But, as we can see, that skeleton wasn't so much something that we knew from another film, and was a pretty original creation, even if it was also not very original, since it was just Godzilla in a way. Number 9. What's that stuff on Shin's tail? I love Shin Godzilla. Not only is it a cool reboot of the original story, but it tells it in such a different way than what we've seen previously, and I'm all about it. And it introduces some new aspects to the big guy, like showing him evolve from whatever he used to be and gaining his appendages. But then it goes further, and we see a leveling up of his atomic breath, complete with unlocking jaw and lasers from his spine and his tail. And yeah, about that tail. At the ending of the movie, they actually figure out a way to stop Godzilla and freeze him in his tracks, effectively killing him. He's left standing in the city, and they're warned that if he were to reawaken, they would hit the city with an immediate nuclear strike. But before it fades to black, we're treated to a view of his tail. And unlike before, it's covered with what appears to be human-like figures frozen and reaching upwards. So, what are they? What's going on here? Especially because there's more to it than you think. First up, let's talk about the humanoid-looking creatures. Now, there are several theories out there floating around as to what they are, based upon what we know from the film. Since the movie doesn't give any concrete answers itself, and it doesn't appear as if they're following up with this version since -1 has come out, all we have to go on is that single shot. And it looks like the most common assumption is the one that I came to as well. Over the course of this film, Godzilla has evolved rapidly. It's essentially what he's done from attack to attack. They hit him with something, and he evolves and mutates to overcome it. Near the ending of the film, against all odds, these tiny human forms are what is finally taking him down. And his body realized that. In order to compensate for this, it did what it always did: evolve. Tiny little humans are causing it trouble, it becomes tiny little humans. These different forms were about to split off, and whether he was going to fully split off into thousands of these little things or just have them accompany his larger form, they were its answer to the humanity's threat. But that's not all. Now, it's a little bit hard to make out in the shot itself, but there's some further photos of the tail in some of the art books and external materials, and the G-Man was literally turning two-faced. Yes, there is a mouth and a jaw on his tail, which better explains why it's blasting radioactive beams. Judging from how the tail seemed to be adapting here, it looks like it may have been going even further than turning into a second head to attack with. That just leaves one question that I've seen people go back and forth on. Did these alterations happen before or after he was frozen? If it happened afterwards, it means that the plan didn't work, and it's still evolving and dealing with the attacks on it, and will continue to cause them troubles. But the other one is the way I lean, particularly since this appears to be the ending of this particular storyline. I think it happened before he froze, and the adaptations occurred just before the chemicals went into effect. This final shot shows just how close we were to the situation being way worse, and also shows that Godzilla knew exactly how much trouble it was in. The humans were winning, and they were using teamwork and community to do so, and it was working. His body knew how screwed it was, and dealt with the impending doom the only way it knew how, evolving into the best way to combat this. In order to overcome humanity, it had to become humanity, and it almost did. But luckily, the freezing kicked in just in time, halting this process right before they had a chance to branch off. To me, this ending increases the drama of the whole freezing process, since their situation was about to become far, far more difficult, as well as underscoring that the true way to defeat the issue was using the teamwork of your fellow man. Question number 2. What was Godzilla always standing on? So this one always bugs me because it's in almost every Godzilla movie. Maybe not the original, but like any movie where Godzilla is out to sea. Our lizard friend is an aquatic creature. He prefers to be in the water and mostly only comes out when he gets the DTs and needs that sweet, sweet radiation buzz. So he does come up out of the water as well. A good deal of time that we see him come out of the ocean, he's near the shore. And we see him stroll up onto whatever beach he's near. But then, every once in a blue moon, someone will encounter him out in the middle of the ocean. The most egregious example of this that I can think of is in Godzilla King of the Monsters, right after they sort of juice him up again. He's in the middle of the deep DC, and after being revived, he meets up with our hero's topside. There, he literally just stands and blast some of his radioactive stuff straight up in the air. But like, what is he standing on? Some people online have tried to answer this recurring question with a series of comical drawings featuring the G-Man with really, really long legs, or like just pulling up an iceberg like a step stool, or even stepping up onto a passing whale. -1 actually seems to take this in consideration. It has our guy standing up in the sea quite a bit, and part of the finale involves him being in a super deep spot. It's actually even a plot point that he's shot deep down and then surfaces back up again. And when he does, he's in the same exact spot that we know is thousands of feet deep, but he's just standing there, upright. Well, in that same movie, they actually kind of address it. Godzilla floats like a duck. Their entire plan at the ending of the film is to counteract that buoyancy by sinking him down to the bottom where the pressure would do him in. Now, he's an underwater-based creature, so it's made for undersea pressure, but not so sudden, which is their whole plan. So, I like this explanation, but it sure does create some funny imagery, and I really wish we could see under the surface, since I would take it to mean that his little legs are kicking like some sort of doggy paddle or lizard lunge or what have you. So there you have it, 10 questions about the big G himself, Godzilla. And yeah, I know that, there might be some diehard Godzilla fans that are watching this video going like, yeah, we knew that. But, I think most people don't know these answers. And when I searched for questions about Godzilla, these were the things that came up the most commonly. And yeah, there were some pretty cool questions in here. Let me know what you thought of these. Let me know what other questions about Godzilla you have, or what other answers to the questions that I posed that you may have. Let me hear that down below. If you enjoyed the video, of course, hit the like button. If you enjoy this channel, hit the subscribe button so you know when new videos are coming up. And of course, check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines and help support this channel. I'd appreciate that. And I always appreciate you coming back to watch these videos. And there will be another great video coming along very, very shortly. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.